Hi Year 8, it's Miss Lewis again. We're going to go on to the next lesson of the Unicellular Organisms topic, which is on decomposers and the carbon cycle. Now, as part of today's lesson, you are going to sort some information into different categories and draw out your own carbon cycle. So you'll need a pen, and either in your exercise book or on paper, make sure you're going to have enough space to do those things, please. So, our title today is Decomposers and Carbon, and I'd like you to please start out with at least one of our starter activities. Starter A asks you what is happening in the pictures and what causes it. You might also say whether you think it is a good or bad thing. Starter B asks you to name as many compounds which contain carbon atoms as you can. Please pause the video and have a go at least one of these. Okay, quick answer check. Starter A. The pictures show things which are decaying. We can see the mould on the surface of the bread and some areas of completely exposed bone on the animal. I know some of you would want to know what animal it is, and I would guess, looking at some of the skeletal features that can be seen, that it's a cow. And if not a cow, then some other agricultural or farm animal. A closer look at the bones would make it easier to tell, and I did study that a little bit at university, so I could probably have a good go. Okay, the food and the animal will have been exposed to microorganisms like bacteria and fungi, either in the air or on the surfaces they are exposed to, and these will cause them to start to decay. You could probably make a case that decaying food is quite wasteful, but overall it's probably a good thing that decay happens because it reduces waste. And then starter B. There are lots of different things we know about which contain carbon. Carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, glucose and sucrose, hydrocarbons such as petrol and diesel, methane, starch, cellulose, and ethanol. You may have also named others, and if you aren't certain of them, Google them to check. Okay, so our lesson today is going to focus on the role which microorganisms play in recycling the carbon which is available to us in our worldwide ecosystem. We're going to name some carbon-containing compounds which are commonly found in our ecosystems. Then we will try to explain the importance of decomposers in our ecosystems, and finally we will aim to predict how different factors will affect the carbon supply available in different ecosystems. To start with, we will introduce the idea of the carbon cycle. All of the living things on planet Earth are carbon-based. This means that carbon or carbon-based compounds play a key role in enabling these living things to survive. We, as animals, wouldn't survive without glucose, which contains carbon, playing a role in releasing the energy we need. Plants would not be able to carry out photosynthesis without the carbon dioxide, which is produced in so many different ways. Carbon plays a key role in so many of the reactions which are necessary to sustain life as we understand it. Having said all this though, there is actually a finite number of atoms of carbon on Earth, and we can't get new ones. When new organisms or new compounds are formed, they are made up using carbon atoms which have been recycled from elsewhere in the ecosystem. They will have been used in billions of carbon compounds supporting life before, and will go on to be recycled and used in billions of carbon-based compounds supporting life in the future. In order for this process of recycling to take place, we need microorganisms, some of which you might have been learning about: bacteria, fungi, and protoctists, to break down the carbon-containing compounds, which might not be being used anymore, which we call stored carbon. Let's see if we can find out how this happens. So, this is the first of our main activities for today's lesson, and all of you are going to try and organise your thoughts on what happens to the carbon atoms within the cycle. In a moment, I will show you 12 statements about different processes which involve carbon atoms. Before that though, I want you to split your page so that you have 3 headings. Under each heading, you will be writing the titles from the 12 statements about carbon. For the sake of your spacing, I will tell you that the maximum number of titles to go under the same heading is 7. You'll figure it out when we go through it. But depending on how you split your page, you might need more than a single line per heading. And your 3 headings are: removes carbon compounds from the air, changes stored carbon from one form to another, and releases carbon compounds into the air. Once you've finished that activity, you are going to try and produce your own version of the carbon cycle. Now, I am going to quickly show you a different version of the carbon cycle first, to give you a few pointers, but there's no point at this stage pausing and copying, because our titles are written in a different way to the ones on the picture you're about to see. You will now be able to see a version of the carbon cycle. You will notice that the arrows do make a circle around, but there are multiple routes which you might take. As it's a cycle, there is no set place where you have to start, but it is common to have carbon dioxide in the atmosphere at the top, as you can see here. The author here has also used different coloured arrows, which you might choose to do for yours if you have the equipment, to show the different categories we've used. On screen now are the 12 statements about carbon. I will read each one for you once, but you will need to pause the video as suits you to write the titles under your headings. Plants carry out photosynthesis. They use carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O, to make glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen, O2. Plants carry out respiration. They react some of their stored glucose, C6H12O6, with oxygen, O2, to produce carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O. Animals eat plants. They use glucose, C6H12O6, stored in plants, to make carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, all containing carbon. Animals flatulate, or fart. Many animals, especially cows, release methane, CH4, gas through their anus. Algae in rivers and seas photosynthesize. They use carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O, to make glucose, C6H12O6, and oxygen, O2. Dead plants and animals can become fossil fuels. Coal, crude oil, and natural gas are hydrocarbons, made from hydrogen and carbon only. Animals carry out respiration. They react glucose, C6H12O6, from their food with oxygen, O2, to produce carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O. Trees burn. Forest fires, both natural and deliberately started, release CO2 from the glucose that is stored in plants. Fungi and bacteria decompose dead organisms. As they break down carbohydrates, proteins, and fats, Microorganisms respire and produce CO2. Animals produce waste. Urea in urine, wee, and fibrous material in feces, poo, are compounds which contain carbon. Fossil fuels burn. Combustion of hydrocarbons produces carbon dioxide, CO2, and water, H2O, and sometimes carbon monoxide, CO, and soot, C. Fungi and bacteria decompose animal waste. As they break down urea and feces, microorganisms respire and produce CO2. Now I would like you to pause the video to put those headings into your categories, just the bold and underlined parts, you don't need to copy the whole things, and then try and produce your carbon cycle. Pause the video and off you go. Then we see our carbon cycle again. If we start from carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you will see that photosynthesis of plants and algae remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, shown here with a blue arrow. Then you will notice a green arrow labelled feeding, which shows the transfer of carbon from one source to another. Other transfers include the production of fossil fuels such as coal, oil and natural gas, and animals producing feces or droppings which need to be broken down. All of the arrows which return to the start of the cycle, carbon dioxide in the air, show carbon compounds being released into the atmosphere, and these processes include respiration, burning, and decomposition of waste. So your cycle should look something similar to this, but perhaps with different words, because we had headings with different titles. So now we're going to look at the answers to the title sorting exercise. Okay, first of all, under removes carbon compounds from the air, you should have two titles only, which are plants carry out photosynthesis and algae photosynthesize. Under the heading changes stored carbon from one form to another, you should have three titles, which are animals eat plants, dead plants and animals become fossil fuels, and animals produce waste, brackets, urine and feces. And then finally, under the heading adds carbon compounds to the air, you should have 7 headings, but for the sakes of fitting it on the screen, we've amalgamated 2 of them together, so you will only see 6 things written on my slide, but you will have 7. And when I say the answers, you will hear 7 answers. You should have animals respire, plants respire, trees burn, fossil fuels burn, fungi and bacteria decompose dead animals, fungi and bacteria decompose animal waste, and animals flatulate. Make sure you have them all in the right places and give yourselves a mark out of 12. Now you're going to show off everything that you've learnt. On the screen you can see 3 questions which you need to try to answer in full and detailed sentences. Or if you prefer a more creative challenge, you need to check out the yellow box towards the bottom. Question 1 asks you to name 4 compounds that contain carbon, including at least 1 gas. And in your answer, make sure you identify the gases you have named. Question 2 asks you to describe 2 ways in which microorganisms, so bacteria, fungi or prototists, help to recycle carbon. And question 3 asks you to explain what would happen to the amount of carbon dioxide in the air if there were no organisms to decompose dead organisms? How might this affect plant life? If you decide to do the creative alternative, you need to produce a dating profile for a fungus which eats dead plants and animals. You need to explain which carbon compounds you eat, the job you do, and why that job is important. Please now pause the video whilst you complete your chosen activity. Okay, we're going to go through the answers to the 3 questions. If you did the creative alternative, perhaps send that one to your teachers to look at. Okay? Answers to the questions. For question 1, you might have identified carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, and methane as gases. And then otherwise, you might have identified urea, glucose, or any other carbohydrate, fossil fuels or other hydrocarbons, coal or methane or those sorts of things, or certain proteins, all of which will exist either as solids or dissolved in water. For question 2, you might have described the role of microorganisms in the process of decaying organic material, such as dead organisms or waste products. You might have described the respiration reaction, which releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Alternatively, you might have described the photosynthesis reaction, which takes place in algae, and it's important it's only algae. This retrieves carbon dioxide which is dissolved in the water, so it can be used by the algae or by organisms that eat the algae. Okay? Photosynthesis in plants isn't a correct answer to that question. Okay? Question 3, you should have written about how a lack of decomposition of dead organisms would mean that there would be less carbon dioxide being released into the air. And there were 2 reasons for this. First, that any carbon stored in the dead remains is not being broken down to be used by other organisms. But also because there will be no microorganisms carrying out respiration as they undertake the process of decomposition, which is energy intensive, so they'd be respiring a fair bit. Okay? That's likely to have other consequences though. It's likely to mean there's less photosynthesis taking place, because there's less carbon dioxide. And it's also likely to cause a reduction in global temperatures, which might cause the growth of organisms, such as plants, to slow down. All of this will cause increases in stored carbon, meaning there are less atoms moving around the cycle. As you can see, we have now worked through all 3 of our learning objectives. You should now be able to have a go at naming some carbon-based compounds we find commonly in our ecosystems. You should also be able to explain why it is so important that we have microorganisms which help us by carrying out decomposition processes in our ecosystems. And finally, you should have had a go at predicting what might happen if any of the factors affecting our carbon supplies were to change. Now, final task for you, which I will leave you with, is to decide for yourselves whether decay is a good or a bad process. I would like you to complete each of the 2 points on the screen, identifying why it is positive and why it is negative, and then use this to give your own personal opinion. So you're going to have, decay is a good thing because, with your reason. Decay is a bad thing because, with your reason. And then, overall, I think decay is a good thing or a bad thing. Okay? I hope you've learned something from this session, and that you have a good idea of why the carbon cycle is so important for all living things. Well done all of you, and thank you for joining.